Hi everyone, it's Krista from Krista's Quilting Services, and I'm here with part 2 of the how to draft your own butterfly block. I went through my stash and I found some scraps that will work. I've prepped the fabric already that I need for the butterfly wings. I just went with a neutral gray. I happen to have this 2.5 inch strip to cut and use for the body, and then kind of a linen colored fabric for my background pieces and the sashing. So I'm going to go over all the cutting parts. If you followed along with the first one, we would have already gone through drafting that butterfly and the sizes of material that we needed to cut for each piece. All right, the wing measurements were what I went through first, so I'm going to start with them. And I found this bright flowery fabric, and I thought this might make a fun butterfly. I already have a kind of a pale pink and a darker blue, and nothing bright yet for my sample piece. So just cut my selvage edge off there. This piece happened to actually be full width. Okay, so our wings, we need, this is folded in half. So I will get, I only need to do each wing cut once because I will get my 2 pieces out of that. The fabric is not directional. If you are choosing to use a directional fabric, you will want to take that into consideration when you're cutting. So I'm going to start with the top wing piece, which is 5.5 inches. So my strip is already 4.5 inches, and that is common between both the top and the bottom wings. So I'm going to line up my ruler for a 5.5 inch, and make sure you double check that you're measuring to the correct spot. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and my 1/2 inch, and looks like I have this lined up quite well. So the wings, the top are finished, and then the bottom. And my bottom set are going to be 4.5 by 4.5. And then put the extra aside. So the next one are the snowball corner pieces, and I'm just gonna double check, but I'm pretty sure, yeah, this is 2.5 wide. I'd already cut this strip from a piece earlier and left this one at 2.5, so I need a 2.5 by 2.5 inch square. And because I have this folded over, I just need to make 1 cut. One and a half by 1.5. Let's see if this is. That does meet, and I think so does this piece. These are from something else I'd cut, but then didn't make the piece long enough. So with a project like this, I'm always just trying to use whatever bits and pieces I have until I just can't anymore. So that's 1, and I will need, they're doubled up, I need 5 sets of these. Okay, so this piece is going to be too big for what I need it, because my strip here is 2.5 inches wide, but my body only needs to be 1 inch wide. So when I do end up using this, I will cut it down to that 1 inch width, and I'll still be able to get one more butterfly body out of my piece here. And I need 8 inches of that. Turn this so I can cut off just the 1 inch width. Go. And this will get used for another one later on. Okay. And then I need a couple of background pieces to go with that butterfly body. I need a 1 by 1 inch piece, and I need these. They do fit. And I need a 2 inch by 1 inch. So I'll cut my 2 inch first. And my 1 inch. Second, there we go. So those will be for the top and the bottom. And now it is on to the border pieces. So these I am going to have to cut from this is 2.5. Oh, that is 2.5. Okay. So, and it is long enough. So I am going to be able to get my 1.25 by 11 inch piece out of here. So let's cut my 11. It's just laying a little bit crooked. Set that bit aside. That straightened out underneath. 1.25. And I'll just check to make sure that this is good as well. Pretty much. Like one side got a tiny bit wide. Sometimes those little bits can make a really big difference. So I do like to make sure I'm trimmed right up to size. And then my 1.5 inch side, I'm going to need to take a cut from the bowl of my fabric. And I'm going to need 2 of these pieces, so I'm just going to cut off my selvage edge. then I need 9.5 inches. Alright, that's it. We've got all our butterfly pieces cut up and we are ready to move on to the assembly stage. We are at the sewing machine and just about ready to get started here. One thing I forgot to do when we were figuring out all the measurements was to write down the order of assembly. So I'm going to do that right here and walk you through how I would assemble it. There's multiple ways that this could be done. But my first thing, I would start off by doing all of my snowballed corners. And when you're adding these details to your draft, they can be brief. This is your first time through a block. It might not be your final draft. So keeping it brief enough for you to know what you're working on as you're working on it, but then adding in better information later on when you have your draft kind of perfected. So after the snowball corners, it will be the body. Actually, I'm just going to put and body here together because I'm going to actually chain piece all of these things through. Then it will be so the top and bottom, wings to each other. The third step will be attaching wings to the body. And then the fourth step, now because there's an order to adding on your sashing pieces, I'm going to separate them. Add side sashing, and then the fifth step, add top and bottom. Okay, of course, in between each of these things, we're going to be stopping to press our seams, and I'm going to use lots of heat and lots of steam, anything to get these blocks to lay as flat as I can. Some of my seams I may just press over, and some of them I may choose to press open. It just sort of depends on what works best for you. The corners here and here, they do line up, so you want to make sure that on one of your pieces, if you're just pressing them off to the side, that you have pressed, that you press them in opposite directions. So you can decide if you want them to kind of nest in. Maybe the top ones you press, like you just kind of flip the triangle back and do that. And then maybe on these ones, you might decide that you're going to turn it the other way, so your seam is facing, or you've pressed the opposite direction. Okay, so I am going to start by laying out my pieces. that's kind of the important thing with this one, double checking everything as you lay it out and making sure that you've got your photo or draft nearby. I already have a completed piece to work from too that's also kind of in my line of sight. When you're laying out the butterfly pieces, because they're both 4.5 wide, but the one batch is 5.5 tall, you do want to make sure that you've got them going correctly. Otherwise, you may end up snowballing your corners in the wrong direction. So you want to make sure that they're the tall way and not wide. And then I've got my corners to be snowballing here, so I'm just going to lay on the first ones that I'm going to be doing. And this doesn't have to be lined up very well. It is going to be kind of messed up as you pick it up and move it to the machine. I'm not going to mark my corners because I have seam guide tape here. So that way when I'm sewing corner to corner, I just make sure that my bottom point is always lined up to here, and I just follow that all the way up into my needle. And then I'm going to add those ones. There. Okay. When snowballing these corners, we don't need to press anything until we've got them all attached. They're not big enough pieces to run into each other at all. When you're doing the snowball corners, you want to make sure that the outside facing piece of each corner is you're going to sew like opposite of that. So from here to here, this seam is going to come from here to here. You don't want to be starting from the very corner, but you want to be starting from kind of the two sides of your corner, from side to side. And same thing with all of these ones. That is sort of the consistent, as long as you're sewing from one edge of your background or of the wing piece to the opposite edge, you're going to have sewn them in the correct direction every time. Even if you twist them or like rotate them to make them fit through your machine. And because there's a possibility that I might be pressing some of my seams open, I have shortened my stitch length, and I'm using a stitch length of 1.5 on my machine. And I believe the other understanding for that is it is 1.5 millimeters per stitch. I always like to start and end with a leader piece. Oh, right. And my bobbin thread is low, so I'm just going to change that out. All right, got a new bobbin in and I'm ready to go. So yeah, just like I had kind of mentioned before, as long as your corner is always facing out and you're sewing from one side of your wing block to the other, you're going to always have this in the right direction. I have a preference to turn my block so that way it's just facing outside that way, and make sure everything's lined up. So I'm checking to make sure that this corner here is lined up to here and that the other corner is lined right up to my needle, and it looks like we're good. And then as the machine brings this in, I do have a brief little spot here where I don't have any seam tape to guide myself through. And then from here onwards, I don't either, but I do have a little like slit in my presser foot, and I can kind of guide the corner in the middle towards that slit, and that's where my needle is as well. And we're gonna grab my fun blade saver from purplehobbies.com, and these come in a whole bunch of colors. I have the green one. I was hoping to find a purple one, but my local quilt shop didn't have one in stock when I went and picked it up. So I'm just going to use that to split these apart. And then we just lay out those blocks all over again. Okay, all right, so we've done the inside and we've done these outsides. So it's time to add a little outside here and here, and then here and here. There's no order to where you line up your corners. Start with whichever ones you want to do first. So if you find it, I find it easier to keep them kind of the opposite of where each part goes. You might find that if you're doing these inside ones, that you might also want to do those inside ones first, and then your top corners are second, and your kind of your bottom outside ones are maybe last. Up to you what order. As long as you lay everything out when you're finished and you reorient and lay on the piece that you need each time, you should come out just fine. Just kind of smooth out, make sure my snowball corner piece is lined up to the wing piece. And because I don't have a front and back, or there's no right or wrong side on my background, I don't have to worry about that. One other trick that you can help yourself with this is making sure that where your four corners meet in the, I guess, sort of the center of the butterfly, there's no snowball corner. The rest of your corners are going to have one though. And I nearly forgot about my butterfly piece. Usually I push this through with some of the first chain piecing, and then it's done and out of the way as well. But this is a good opportunity to talk about my little green bit of tape here. So I do use a 1/4 foot with a seam guide for my presser foot. But I also find that I like having something to set my fabric against earlier. It just seems to help guide everything through, and it keeps it straight underneath, since the presser foot is like, it's a very scant 1/4 inch. So I just use like a green painter's tape. I believe it comes in a blue option as well. And that helps me keep it all in line better. And the painter's tape isn't sticky, not like masking tape, and definitely never use like duct tape, Gorilla Tape, anything like that. Unless you are really wanting things to be permanent. But it will just make a big mess of your machine because of how sticky it is if you ever try to take things off. There we go. Okay, so all of those pieces are done. They're chained together, and this will get folded back in a moment. I am going to do one more double check to make sure it's all in the right place. Once you sew in these big corners, these pieces have a right direction, and that you've got to be careful of. when piecing together this flock, or even anything that you might have a pattern for that is similar. So this will flip back and that will flip back, so those are good. And when these flip back, they take care of the background. Yep. So everything is all facing in that right direction. Once you've double checked that, then you can go ahead and cut some of these pieces off at the corners. You can cut them off using scissors. I have a preference to keep those seams really straight and line up my ruler with that. So I'll be right back with some trimmed off corners. All right, let's clip off these corners. So you want to make sure that you are cutting from the correct direction. You want to take that small little bit off, and I just line up my 1/4 inch line on the seam line and run my cutter across. And this is like tiny. There's nothing that can be done with that. So unless you've got something that you use those tiny little scraps for stuffing, you can go ahead and just toss out those bits. Let's get these pressed out. So I always like to set those seams first. And then with these ones on your top wing, you can press them entirely back. And like to just use the tip of the nose of my iron just to get that corner to come over nicely. And you can just let your iron sit on top of it for a little for a quick moment. Especially with these blocks the way that they are, you do have some bias that could potentially distort. There we go. So I have the top pieces of my butterfly pressed, and with the bottom one, when I go to sew these sides here together, across, I'm going to want them to nest, which means that for this corner, I'm going to want to flip it back the opposite direction. If you're not sure about where your seams might nest, if that's kind of complicated or if they're potentially going every which way, the easiest really is just to shorten that stitch length right up and then to go ahead and press those seams open. Okay, I like to always trim up as I go. So because of how you snowball a corner, the size of your initial butterfly wing that you cut, that piece, should still be the same 4.5 by 4.5 inch piece. But sometimes when you start adding other pieces of fabric, sometimes little pieces start to kind of like hang off and a little bit maybe needs to be trimmed before you go to sew in your next part. So I'm going to give a tiny bit of a trim there. And sometimes you can see where you've got just the little bit of a flaw, like if you're you didn't press over well and you've got a little bit of a fold perhaps in your fabric. Those are all things that you can see. So this one turned out pretty good. Just one of my corners went a little bit wonky and had that little bit to stretch or to kind of cut off. And this one also looks really good all the way around. Nothing to do there. And this one is going to be 4.5 by 5.5. So pretty much you're just looking at, because I'm just putting my ruler over top, so you're just looking for that half line at the top to see if it comes all to that. And that one also looks good. This corner is slightly sunk down. That will get corrected when I go to sew up the rest of the block. Yep, that one looks good too. All right, I have all my pieces lined up and ready to go. And as I was lining them up, I noticed that something wasn't quite right because my butterfly body piece is already too big. And when I went back through, I realized I added, for whatever reason, a whole inch to this gray piece, and I only needed to add a half an inch. So it is time to grab that seam ripper. All right, so now we're going to attach the top and the bottom pieces together. And make sure that they are going the right direction. So when I grabbed these, I realized that my two non-snowballed corners needed to be matching. I knew that, so I was able to catch that and adjust for that. And then line up and nest your seams there. I sometimes like to start with the snowballed corner. If you start from the other end, sometimes like your presser foot can push your fabric in one direction or the other just a tiny bit, and then your seams won't line up the way that you were hoping for them to line up. So if you start at the top where it's closest, you're going to have the most success in keeping them lined up together. Okay, I have laid out my butterfly again, and the more you start sewing each piece together, the more it starts to look like that butterfly. So these ends here, they are now the same length as this. When you're sewing some of your pieces together, you might end up with things feeling like they're not going to fit because one piece might be a little bigger than the next. But the reality is, if you still have a seam line to add in, that other piece is still going to be either a little bit too small or something might seem a little too big. So here I don't have any seams to actually match up, and I find it easier to sew my narrow piece down first on top. And my big part, I'm just going to make sure that my corner is good. Take a few stitches and then I can smooth out the rest.
And I will press this before I sew down to the other half. So this one, if you are wanting to have the body of your body, or the body of your butterfly, if you're wanting this to stand out and give this no great parts of texture, then you can go ahead and just press that right back.
Okay, I'm going to use my square ruler for this part, and it is supposed to be 9 by 9.5. And my sides, yes. So my sides going up and down, these are 9.5 cut when I go to add that sashing. And when I get that trimmed, because I will have to trim those to make sure that they are at 11 inches. So that way when I put my top and my bottom on, that they are correct. So when I'm doing this, one thing that I look for is any place that's maybe warped a little bit. I've got a little bit of fabric that's trying to say stick out beyond my line, and I do have a little bit here and a tiny little bit here at the top as well. So keeping that and just trimming that bit back makes it much easier when you're sewing it, or when you're sewing on your sashing, to keep your line nice and straight all the way through. So that wasn't much, but sometimes just those little pieces can make a difference. Check it from here. And then anything that's sticking out at this point will need to come off. The corners are in just a tiny bit, and they do want to just kind of pull in. So your sashing, when you add it, is going to help stabilize them too and keep them out nice. So you do want to watch for that when you are kind of cleaning up your edges, that if you're panicking because you're like, oh, that bit doesn't quite come out to that line, it probably still does. Yeah. So these, you can see here, they are just shy of that line, but not so much. So as soon as I add my pieces all the way around, it's going to help straighten those out. But what I have now are no more little bits that are trying to stick out anywhere. Check tiny bit here. Oh. And sometimes it's nice just to sew with a little bit of a cleaner edge. So even if the only thing that ends up being trimmed off are some of those frayed edges, it's just nicer. Other things that you can do to help make sure your ruler is straight too are looking for other sew lines within. So my body, I've got markings here on either side, and so I can actually see that my body came in nice and straight, and it is right on where I want it to be. Back to the sewing machine. All right, so it's important to make sure that the sides go first. They are a shorter piece, so always good still, even though it's sashing, to lay out to make sure that you're grabbing from the right place. Otherwise, if you start with the top or the bottom, your piece is going to be much too long. Okay, so that looks good. So I'm going to do the sides first, press second, and then trim up to 11 inches afterwards. Okay, I need my block to measure 11 by 11, which I know it doesn't. And that was by design because we just cut our sashing pieces just a tiny bit larger. Now, this is very, very close. So when you need to shave off a little bit, it's always helpful if you can line up to your seam line. So I've got a spot right here, and I've got my other one right here. So I can see that there's just a tiny bit of overage, but not much. And same thing on this side, there's just a tiny bit of overage on that as well. So I'm going to keep it where it is because it's ultimately centered over my entire block, or at least from width to width. Let's make sure we're totally good. Yep. Make sure I put lots of weight down because I do not want this to slip on me. Go. I'll cut up. That's like, for you to cut this exact, you would have had to make each side like an 1/8 inch smaller than what we cut it to. And cutting to 1/4 inches are easy enough. An 1/8 of an inch, that's just a little harder to try and line up. So I have a preference to always just then round up. And sometimes you have, like if your seam allowance was just a little bit big or anything like that, you might not even take off the entire amount. Okay, I'm going to sew the side that wasn't totally straight first, just because it's fresh in my mind and I know that I need to be careful when I hit that point. I'm going to place my narrow piece on the top. Mostly just that is my preference, but also it does give me that straight side to continue sewing down. That way I'm not tempted to follow that little bit of waver from the corner that wanted to come in a little bit.
take a look and see what we've got. Yep. Those were the new sides, and yeah, it looks like everything is right on at 11 by 11. So I don't even have to trim anything off on this particular side.
Okay, I hope everything between the drafting video and the piecing video to check our drafting was helpful to you. And as you can see, it's always good to double check things as you go along. Sometimes, like, I thought my last piece was going to be a little bit bigger and maybe needed to be trimmed down. So really important to double check all your measurements as you go. And if it doesn't quite work out the first time and you realize when you're actually piecing it, oh, I was too short by 1/4 inch, then, not a big deal. You just recut your piece, make your measurement change on your notes so that way it reflects the size that it needs to be. Make sure you're checking for your seam width all the way through as well, because if your seam gets to be too big or too small, it could lead you to think that your measurements are maybe off when they weren't really. There's a lot that goes into it, but hopefully these the 2-part video here helps you start working towards formulating and drafting out your own patterns and ideas. All right, I hope you learned lots, and I'll see you next time. Take care.